Everyone avoided the Apache widow in black until a lonely rancher for decades called her gorgeous, and the truth he discovered about her 3 dead husbands would tear apart everything the frontier town thought they knew about love, death, and the woman who walked between 2 worlds. Inside the Broken Wheel Saloon, the air hung thick with tobacco smoke, the sharp bite of rot-gut whiskey, and something else that couldn't be bottled or bought, the metallic taste of genuine terror. Cowhands and prospectors hunched over their drinks like men sharing secrets with the devil himself, their voices dropping to gravelly whispers whenever the conversation turned to her. "I'm telling you, boys," growled Tom Briggs, his face scarred. "From a lifetime of breaking broncos and harder men, that Apache woman ain't natural. 3 husbands dead and buried, each one meeting his maker in ways that would make a grown man weep." He spat into the brass spittoon beside his chair, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the sudden silence.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
The other men leaned in closer, their weathered faces illuminated by the flickering light of oil lamps that cast dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the saloon's batwing doors and carrying with it the distant howl of coyotes, for something that might have been coyotes. "First husband was Marcus Bellwether," Tom continued, his voice taking on the cadence of a man reciting scripture or reading from a death warrant. "Rich merchant from back east, came out here looking to make his fortune in silver. Found himself a beautiful Apache wife instead, against all common sense and the warnings of every Christian soul in town." He paused to drain his glass, the whiskey burning a path down his throat like liquid courage. Bellwether was a good man, never raised his hand to nobody, treated her like she was made of spun gold and morning sunlight. But 6 months after the wedding, they found him at the bottom of Serpent's Canyon, his neck broke clean through. Horse came back without a rider, acting spooked like it had seen the devil himself. Tom's eyes grew distant, remembering details that had haunted the town for years. Jake Morrison, a young cowpoke with more courage than sense, shifted uneasily in his chair. Could have been an accident. Canyon's treacherous, especially when the winds pick up. Could have been, Tom agreed, his tone suggesting he believed otherwise. But then came husband number 2, Dr. William Thornfield, an educated man from Philadelphia who came out here to study Apache medicine. Thought he could bridge the gap between white man's science and Indian healing. The old bronc rider's laugh held no humor, just the bitter taste of irony. Thornfield married her quick as lightning, said she was the most beautiful woman he'd ever laid eyes on, with skin like burnished copper and eyes that held the wisdom of ancient spirits. Man was book smart but desert foolish, if you ask me. Started learning Apache ways, speaking their tongue, participating in their ceremonies. Tom's voice dropped even lower, forcing the men to strain forward to catch his words. Found him 3 days after the autumn equinox, dead in his own surgery. Looked like he'd been sampling his own medicines, but every bottle in that place was poison wolfsbane, hemlock, desert nightshade. Coroner said he'd been poisoned slow and careful, like someone wanted him to suffer before he died. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of someone's glass hitting the table too hard. "And the third?" Jake asked, though his voice suggested he already knew the answer would chill his blood. Tom's eyes grew hard as flint. "Sheriff David Crenshaw. Big man, tough as rawhide, feared by every outlaw and desperado from here to El Paso. He married Katori Blackstone against the advice of every decent person in 3 territories. Said he'd protect her from the gossip and the pointing fingers." The bronc rider's voice turned grim as a funeral bell. They found Crenshaw in his own jail cell, door locked from the inside, key still in his pocket. 3 bullets in his chest, his own gun in his hand, but the angles were all wrong for suicide. Man had been shot from across the room, but there wasn't another soul in that building. Some say they heard Apache death chants drifting through the night wind, just before they found the body. Tom finished his tale with the air of a man delivering a final judgment. Eddie McCall, an old prospector whose hands shook from too many years of hard living and harder drinking, spoke up from the corner where shadows gathered thickest. My grandmother was part Cherokee, and she told me stories about women like that, spirit walkers who could move between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. His voice carried the weight of generations of whispered warnings. Says the Apache have medicine that can kill a man with a glance, curse him so his own shadow turns against him. That woman's got powers that ain't meant for Christian folk to understand. Eddie's roomy eyes darted toward the saloon doors, as if expecting something supernatural to come walking through. Young Jake Morrison tried to inject some reason into the conversation. Now hold on there, Eddie. You're talking about magic and curses like we're living in some penny dreadful novel. Maybe those men just had bad luck. Bad luck? Tom Briggs slammed his fist on the table, making every glass jump. 3 men, 3 different ways of dying, all connected to the same woman. That ain't luck, boy, that's a pattern. That's something dark and deliberate, working its way through our town like a plague. His eyes blazed with the fervor of a man who had seen too much to believe in coincidence. I seen her walking through town in that black dress of hers, moving like smoke given shape and substance. Never speaks to nobody, never looks directly at a man's face, just glides through the streets like she's already buried and come back to finish some unnatural business. Tom's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried more weight than his loudest shout. Children cross the street when they see her coming, and horses rear up like they smell something dead. Dogs won't stop howling when she passes, and every clock in town stops ticking until she's gone by. That ain't natural behavior for God-fearing creatures. The old bronc rider's words painted a picture that made grown men reach for another drink. As the night wore on and the whiskey flowed, the stories grew more elaborate and frightening. Someone claimed to have seen Katori Blackstone standing on her roof during thunderstorms, arms raised to the sky as lightning danced around her like obedient serpents. Another swore he had witnessed her speaking to ravens in the Apache tongue, the black birds nodding their heads as if receiving orders from a general. My wife won't even shop at the trading post when that woman's in town, confessed Ben Hawthorne, a local rancher whose hands bore the calluses of honest work. Says Katori's got the evil eye, can curse a person just by looking at them wrong. Last month, Mrs. Henderson made the mistake of bumping into her at the general store next day. Every chicken on the Henderson spread was dead, not a mark on them. His words carried the conviction of a man reporting gospel truth. And what about the widow's walk? Added Charlie Bent, the local blacksmith whose massive arm showed the scars of a lifetime working with fire and iron. Every full moon, you can see her up there on the ridge behind her house, walking back and forth like she's calling to spirits only she can see. Makes my blood run cold, just thinking about it. The big man shuddered despite the saloon's warmth. The widow's walk had become the stuff of local legend, a narrow path carved into the red rock mesa behind Katori's isolated adobe house, where she was said to commune with the spirits of her dead husbands and plot the demise of any man foolish enough to court her. Children dared each other to climb up there during daylight hours, but none had ever been brave enough to accept the challenge. Preacher Malcolm says she's in league with Satan himself, whispered Frank Gully, the town's undertaker whose profession gave weight to his words about death and the supernatural. Says her Apache blood makes her susceptible to pagan influences, and her beauty is just a trap to lure good Christian men to their doom. He's been preaching about the dangers of mixing with heathens ever since she came to town. The undertaker's words carried the authority of a man who had buried all 3 of her husbands. The fear had grown so pervasive that Katori Blackstone had become a prisoner in her own community. The general store refused to serve her directly, forcing her to leave money on the counter and take what she needed without speaking to another soul.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
The bank conducted business with her through written notes passed under barred windows. Even the post office required her to use a separate entrance, as if her presence might contaminate the mail of decent folk. She used to be different, admitted Doc Patterson, the town's physician who had treated all three of her deceased husbands. In their final days, when she first came to Mesa Verde as Marcus Bellwether's bride, she was full of life and laughter, had a smile that could light up a room and a way of speaking that made you forget she wasn't born to our ways. The old doctor's voice carried a note of genuine sadness. But something changed after Marcus died. She withdrew into herself, started dressing in black like she was in perpetual mourning. When she married Dr. Thornfield, folks thought she might return to her old self, but if anything, she became more distant, more mysterious. After Sheriff Crenshaw's death, she stopped trying to be part of our community altogether. Doc Patterson stared into his glass as if searching for answers in the amber liquid. Can't say I blame her, the doctor continued. The way people started crossing themselves when she walked by, the way mothers pulled their children close and whispered warnings about the Apache widow, would be enough to drive any soul into isolation. His words hung in the air like an accusation, making some of the men shift uncomfortably in their chairs. That was when a new voice cut through the smoky air of the saloon, deep and weathered, like aged leather, carrying the authority of a man who had seen enough of the world to know the difference between truth and superstition. You're all wrong about her. Every head in the Broken Wheel Saloon turned toward the far corner, where Wade Crow Harrison sat nursing a single glass of whiskey that had barely been touched. The rancher had been silent throughout the evening's storytelling, his weather-beaten face hidden in the shadows cast by his wide-brimmed hat. But now he stepped forward into the lamplight, and the assembled men could see the steel in his gray eyes. Wade Harrison was a man who commanded respect without demanding it, a rancher who had carved his spread out of hostile territory through sheer determination and an iron will that had never bent to anyone or anything. He had been working his land for over 20 years, watching towns rise and fall, seeing men come and go like tumbleweeds on the desert wind. When Wade Harrison spoke, people listened. You sit here spinning ghost stories and fairy tales about a woman you've never bothered to know, he continued, his voice carrying the quiet authority of absolute conviction. Talking about curses and evil eyes like your children frightened by shadows on the wall. Every one of you has decided she's guilty of something without ever asking what she might be guilty of. His words fell like stones into still water, creating ripples of discomfort. Throughout the room, Tom Briggs bristled at the challenge to his authority as the town's chief storyteller. And I suppose you know better than the rest of us, Harrison. You got some special insight into that woman's black heart? The bronc rider's voice carried a sneer that didn't quite hide his nervousness at being confronted. Wade's smile was thin as a knife blade. I got eyes that work and a brain that hasn't been pickled in whiskey and superstition. I got the sense God gave a jackrabbit and enough decency to judge a person by their actions instead of their bloodline. He stepped closer to the table where the other men sat, his presence seeming to fill the room. What I see is a woman who's buried 3 husbands and been blamed for their deaths, without a shred of proof beyond the color of her skin and the fear in your hearts. What I see is a community so eager to find a scapegoat that they've forgotten the difference between justice and persecution. Wade's voice carried the weight of moral certainty that made lesser men uncomfortable. The rancher pulled out a chair and sat down, his movements deliberate and controlled. Let me tell you what I've observed about Katori Blackstone, the truth instead of the mythology you've built around her. His gray eyes swept the room, challenging any man present to interrupt him. I've watched her tend to sick animals with a gentleness that would shame most Christian souls. Seen her leave food and medicine on the doorsteps of families too proud to ask for help, but too poor to refuse charity. Witnessed her nursing wounded Apache warriors and white settlers with equal care, never asking which side they fought on or what God they prayed to. Wade's words painted a different picture than the one the men had been sharing. When the Henderson children got lost in the desert last spring, who was it that tracked them down and brought them home safe? When the flash flood nearly washed out the Martinez farm, who was it that helped them rebuild without expecting payment or thanks? When old Mrs. Kowalski was dying of lung fever, who sat by her bedside for 3 days straight, brewing medicine and offering comfort to a woman who had never shown her anything but suspicion and scorn? The rancher's questions hung in the air, like accusations. That woman you've decided is a monster has done more good for this community than most of you combined. She's saved lives, healed wounds, and asked for nothing in return except to be left in peace. And how do you repay her kindness? With gossip, superstition, and the kind of ignorant hatred that makes me ashamed to call myself a citizen of this town. Wade's voice carried the passion of a man defending something precious. Doc Patterson nodded slowly, his professional ethics finally overcoming his social cowardice. Wade's right about her healing abilities. That woman knows more about desert medicine than any doctor who ever graduated from a fancy Eastern college. She's got herbs and remedies that can cure ailments I've given up on. Saved my own life when I got bit by that rattler last summer, mixed up a poultice that drew the poison right out. The physician's admission carried the weight of professional testimony. Wade Harrison stood up slowly, his chair scraping against the wooden floor with the finality of a coffin lid closing. Here's what I propose to all you brave men sitting here, trading those stories and slanderous gossip. His voice carried the challenge of a gunfighter calling out a coward. Tomorrow morning, I'm riding out to Katori Blackstone's place. I'm going to look her in the eye and tell her what I think of her, that she's the most gorgeous woman I've ever seen, inside and out, that she's got more courage in her little finger than the lot of you combined. And if your curses and evil eyes are real, then I reckon I'll find out soon enough. The rancher's declaration hit the room like a thunderclap. You're making a mistake, Harrison, Tom Briggs warned, his voice tight with genuine concern despite their disagreement. That woman's already buried 3 husbands. You really want to be number 4? The bronc rider's question carried the weight of prophecy. Wade's smile was sharp as a razor. Maybe those 3 men didn't die because they married an Apache woman. Maybe they died because they lived in a town full of people who couldn't see past the color of her skin to the beauty of her soul. Maybe they died of loneliness and heartbreak, surrounded by neighbors who treated their wife like a plague carrier. His words cut deep, exposing wounds the community preferred to keep hidden. And maybe, he continued, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more weight than a shout, it's time someone in this godforsaken town had the courage to treat that woman with the respect and admiration she deserves. Maybe it's time someone looked past the fear and saw the truth that's been staring you in the face all along. Wade Harrison turned toward the saloon doors, his decision made and his course set. You mark my words, he said over his shoulder, his voice carrying the authority of absolute conviction. Tomorrow I'm going to court Katori Blackstone like she's the finest lady in all of New Mexico territory. And if that makes me the 4th dead husband, then at least I'll die knowing I treated a good woman the way she deserved to be treated. The batwing doors swung shut behind him, leaving the assembled men to contemplate the challenge he had thrown down like a gauntlet in the dust. Outside, the desert wind carried the rancher's words across the red rock mesas and down into the valley where Katori Blackstone sat alone in her adobe house, unaware that tomorrow would bring the first man in 3 years, brave enough to see her as something other than a symbol of fear and superstition. Dawn broke across the Harrison ranch like spilled blood on the horizon, painting the red rock mesas in shades of fire and copper that had witnessed 1,000 sunrises before Wade Harrison was born and would witness 1,000 more after he was gone. The rancher stood on his weathered porch, coffee steaming in his calloused hands, watching the desert wake up around him with the slow deliberation of something ancient and eternal. 23 years he had worked this land, carved it from hostile territory with sweat, blood, and the kind of stubborn determination that turned boys into men and men into legends. His spread covered 15,000 acres of the most unforgiving country in New Mexico territory, where the summer sun could kill a man and the winter winds could freeze his soul. But Wade Harrison had not just survived, he had thrived. The ranch house behind him bore the scars of those decades' bullet holes from Apache raids, burn marks from prairie fires, the deep gouges left by hailstones the size of turkey eggs. But it stood solid as the mountains, built from adobe and timber, and reinforced with the kind of iron will that bent to no man's authority. 3 bedrooms that had never housed children, a kitchen table that seated 8 but usually served 1. Parlor furniture that had waited 20 years for guests who never came. Wade had been married once, a lifetime ago, when he was young enough to believe in fairy tale endings and foolish enough to think love could conquer the brutality of frontier life. Sarah Mae Hutchinson had been the prettiest girl in 3 counties, with golden hair that caught sunlight like spun silk and blue eyes that held promises of domestic bliss, and Sunday dinners with grandchildren gathered around a table groaning under the weight of abundance. But the desert had claimed her like it claimed everything beautiful and fragile, stolen her away with the consumption that turned her delicate cough into blood-soaked handkerchiefs and her rosy cheeks into the pale translucence of approaching death. She had died in his arms on a February morning when the snow lay 3 feet deep and the nearest doctor was 2 days' ride through Apache territory. He had buried her under the cottonwood tree beside the creek, where wildflowers bloomed every spring like nature's own memorial service. Since then, Wade Harrison had lived alone by choice rather than circumstance, turning away the advances of available women with the polite firmness of a man who had loved once and loved completely. He had built his life around solitude, finding companionship in his horses and cattle, taking comfort in the unchanging rhythms of ranch work that demanded everything and asked for nothing in return. But last night in the Broken Wheel Saloon, something had stirred in him that he thought had died with Sarah Mae, a protective instinct towards someone vulnerable, a rage against injustice that burned hotter than branding iron. The way those men had spoken about Katori Blackstone, the casual cruelty of their assumptions and the poisonous certainty of their prejudice, had awakened something in Wade that he had kept buried for 2 decades. Wade Harrison was not a man to make idle boasts or empty threats, and the challenge he had thrown down in the saloon would be met with the same methodical preparation he brought to every aspect of ranch life. He moved through his morning routine with the precision of a man who had learned that attention to detail could mean the difference between life and death on the frontier. He selected his best shirt from the cedar chest in his bedroom, a white cotton garment that Sarah Mae had sewn for him during their brief courtship, saved for special occasions that had rarely come in the years since her death. The fabric still held the faint scent of lavender from the sachet she had made, a ghost of sweetness that reminded him of better times and lost possibilities. His black suit jacket had been tailored in Denver during his one trip to civilization, cut from wool fine enough for a banker or politician, but practical enough for a man who made his living with his hands. The silver buttons bore the engraving of a soaring eagle, chosen because it reminded him of the freedom he had found in the vastness of the territory. Wade polished his boots until they gleamed like black mirrors, each stroke of the brush a meditation on the importance of showing proper respect to a lady. He had been raised by a mother who understood the significance of first impressions, who had drilled into her son the notion that how a man presented himself spoke volumes about his character and intentions. The rancher selected a bouquet from his own garden, a hidden luxury that few knew existed behind the practical facade of his ranch house. Wade Harrison grew roses in defiance of the desert, coaxing beauty from soil that seemed determined to support only thorns and tumbleweeds. The blooms were deep red, the color of wine and sunset, their petals soft as silk and fragrant as a prayer. But roses alone seemed insufficient for a woman who had endured the scorn and suspicion of an entire community. Wade added desert marigolds for their bright defiance of harsh conditions, Indian paintbrush for its wild beauty, and stalks of Apache plume for their significance to her heritage. The arrangement spoke of respect, admiration, and an understanding that beauty could be found in the most unlikely places. The journey to Katori Blackstone's isolated homestead took Wade across terrain that told the story of the land's violent history. Ancient arrowheads glinted in the morning light, marking the sites of long-forgotten battles between Apache warriors and cavalry soldiers, prospectors and cattle barons, anyone brave or foolish enough to claim dominion over country that belonged to no man. Wade's horse, a magnificent black stallion named Thunder, moved with the easy confidence of an animal that had carried his master through 20 years of danger and triumph. The horse had been a gift from an Apache chief whose life Wade had saved during the blizzard, pulling the wounded warrior from a snow-filled canyon and nursing him back to health without regard for the color of his skin or the history of conflict. Between their peoples, the desert landscape shifted around them like a living thing. Red rock giving way to patches of green where underground springs fed cottonwoods and willows, creating oases of life in an otherwise hostile environment. Hawks circled overhead, riding thermals that rose from sun-baked stone, their cries echoing across valleys that had witnessed the passage of countless generations, as they climbed toward the mesa where Katori's house stood isolated against the sky. Wade found himself thinking about the stories he had heard, separating fact from fiction with the analytical mind of a man accustomed to reading sign and tracking prey. 3 husbands dead under mysterious circumstances, but mysterious to whom? To men who refused to look beyond their own prejudices for rational explanations. Marcus Bellwether's death in Serpent's Canyon could easily have been an accident. The narrow trail was treacherous, made more dangerous by winds that could spook a horse and send both animal and rider tumbling into the rocky depths below. How many men had died in similar falls without anyone suggesting supernatural intervention? Dr. Thornfield's poisoning might have been suicide rather than murder, a man of science discovering that his medical knowledge was inadequate to bridge the gap between cultures, overwhelmed by the complexity of trying to understand Apache healing traditions while maintaining his standing in the white community. Depression and despair had claimed many frontier physicians who came west expecting to find simple answers to complex problems. Sheriff Crenshaw's death in his own jail cell presented more puzzling circumstances, but Wade had heard whispers about the lawman's gambling debts and his involvement with corrupt territorial officials. A man in Crenshaw's position made enemies easily, and locked doors meant little to professional killers who knew their trade. Perhaps Katori's only crime had been loving a man whose past had finally caught up with him. Katori Blackstone's homestead appeared before them like a mirage made real, an adobe structure that seemed to grow from the red rock itself, its walls the color of sunset and its lines flowing like water shaped by wind and time. The house was smaller than Wade had expected, but more beautiful, with carved wooden doors and windows, framed by flowering vines that spoke of a woman's touch and an eye for the aesthetic details that turned shelter into home. A garden flourished behind a low stone wall, defying the desert's hostility with rows of corn, beans, and squash, the 3 sisters of Apache agriculture that had sustained her people for generations beyond counting. Fruit trees provided shade and sustenance, their branches heavy with apples and peaches that seemed impossibly lush in the arid landscape. Herbs grew in careful patterns, their medicinal properties known to those wise enough to learn the ancient secrets. Wade dismounted near the garden gate, his eyes taking in details that spoke of a woman living alone but not in defeat. Laundry hanging neat and clean on lines strung between cottonwood trees. A well-maintained chicken coop where fat hens scratched contentedly in the dust. A small corral holding 2 horses that looked healthy and well cared for despite their advanced age. But it was the woman herself who took his breath away when She emerged from behind the house, carrying a basket of vegetables from her morning harvest. Katori Blackstone moved with the fluid grace of someone completely at home in her environment, her black dress flowing around her like water, her long dark hair braided with silver ornaments that caught the light like captured stars. She was beautiful in ways that transcended the conventional standards of frontier society. Her copper skin glowed with health and vitality. Her dark eyes held depths that spoke of wisdom earned through suffering. Her features combined the proud heritage of her Apache ancestors with something uniquely her own. But it was more than physical beauty that struck Wade. It was the dignity with which she carried herself, the quiet strength that radiated from her like heat from forge-warmed iron. Katori saw him before he spoke, her senses honed by years of living in territory where danger could approach from any direction. She set down her basket with deliberate care, her movements betraying no fear despite the isolation of her home and the unexpected appearance of a man who could easily overpower her if his intentions proved hostile. "Mr. Harrison," she said, her voice carrying the musical cadence of someone who spoke multiple languages fluently, Apache flowing into English with the ease of water finding its level. "You are far from your ranch this morning." Her words held neither welcome nor rejection, simply acknowledgement of his presence and a question about his purpose. Wade removed his hat with the automatic courtesy his mother had drilled into him, his gray hair catching the morning light as he offered a respectful nod. "Miss Blackstone, I hope you'll forgive the intrusion, but I had something I needed to say to you personally." He held out the bouquet of flowers, their colors bright against the neutral tones of his clothing. She looked at the offering with genuine surprise, her dark eyes moving from the roses to his face, as if trying to decipher the meaning behind this unprecedented gesture. "Flowers," she said softly, her voice carrying a note of wonder that suggested it had been a very long time since anyone had brought her gifts. "Beautiful flowers for a beautiful woman," Wade said simply, his words carrying the weight of absolute sincerity. "Though I suspect these pale beside the beauty of the woman I'm hoping will accept them." He stepped closer, close enough to see the flecks of gold in her dark eyes, close enough to catch the faint scent of sage and wildflowers that seemed to cling to her like an expensive perfume. Katori's composure cracked slightly, revealing a vulnerability that she normally kept hidden behind walls built from years of suspicion and rejection. "You should not be here," she said quietly, her voice carrying concern rather than anger. "The people in town, they will say terrible things about you if they learn you visited me." Her words spoke of a woman accustomed to being blamed for the consequences of other people's choices. "Let them talk," Wade replied, his voice carrying the confidence of a man who had never cared much for public opinion. "I've spent 20 years building a reputation based on my actions, not my associations. If the good people of Copper Canyon want to judge me for treating a lady with the respect she deserves, then they're welcome to try." His words carried a challenge that extended beyond their immediate conversation. Katori accepted the flowers, with hands that trembled slightly, her fingers brushing against his as she took the bouquet. The contact lasted only a moment, but Wade felt something pass between them, not the supernatural charge of the townspeople's imagination, but the simple human connection of two lonely souls recognizing kindred spirits in unexpected places. "Would you care for coffee?" she asked, the offer carrying the weight of a significant decision. Inviting a white man into her home would violate every social convention of frontier society, marking both of them as outcasts in different ways. But something in Wade's manner, his genuine respect, his obvious sincerity, his willingness to stand against popular opinion had convinced her to take the risk. "I would be honored," Wade replied, following her toward the house while thunder grazed contentedly near the garden gate. The interior of Katori's home revealed a woman of refined tastes and practical skills. Apache textiles decorated walls lined with books in multiple languages. Medicine bundles hung beside modern medical instruments, traditional pottery shared shelf space with contemporary dishware. The kitchen smelled of coffee and fresh bread, sage and something else Wade couldn't identify but found strangely comforting. Katori moved with efficient grace, her domestic skills evident in the way she prepared their morning meal. Coffee ground from beans she roasted herself, bread baked in an outdoor oven of her own construction, preserves made from fruit trees. She had planted and tended. "You live well here," Wade observed, his eyes taking in details that spoke of self-sufficiency and careful planning. "Most people couldn't make this land support them the way you have." His words carried genuine admiration for her accomplishments. "The desert provides for those who understand its ways," Katori replied, pouring coffee into cups made from blue-glazed pottery. "My grandmother taught me the old knowledge, which plants heal, which seasons to plant and harvest, how to read the signs that tell of coming weather or approaching danger." Her voice carried pride in her heritage and gratitude for wisdom passed down through generations. As they sat across from each other at a table worn smooth by years of use, Wade found himself studying the woman the town had transformed into a figure of supernatural terror. Up close, away from the distorting lens of prejudice and fear, Katori Blackstone revealed herself to be remarkable but entirely human, intelligent, resilient, beautiful in ways that had nothing to do with magic or mystery. "The men in town," Wade began carefully, "they tell stories about you that would make a person think you commanded armies of spirits and controlled the forces of life and death." He sipped his coffee, finding it rich and perfectly prepared, better than anything served in the Broken Wheel Saloon. Katori's smile held sadness rather than amusement. "Men tell stories to explain things they do not understand. It is easier to believe in curses than to accept that sometimes bad things happen to good people for no reason at all." Her words carried the wisdom of someone who had been blamed for circumstances beyond her control. "3 husbands," Wade said gently, giving her the opportunity to tell her own story without the distortion of gossip and speculation. "That's a heavy burden for any woman to carry, especially one as young as yourself." His tone carried compassion rather than judgment. Katori was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing patterns on the wooden table as if drawing strength from the familiar texture. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of grief kept private for too long. "Marcus was a good man who tried to understand my world but could never truly belong to it. He died because he rode a trail he didn't know well enough, on a horse that spooked at the scent of a mountain lion. Simple as that, no curse, no evil spirits, just a moment of bad judgment that cost him his life." Her words carried the ring of truth. "William Dr. Thornfield, he was brilliant but tormented. He came west thinking he could bridge 2 worlds. But the more he learned about Apache medicine, the more he realized how little his university training had actually taught him. He began experimenting with powerful plants, trying to understand their properties through direct experience. One night he made a mistake with dosages, mixing compounds that should never be combined. I found him in his surgery, already beyond help." Tears glittered in her dark eyes as she continued. "And David Sheriff Crenshaw, he was murdered by men he had been investigating for corruption. They used our marriage as cover, knowing that if he died, I would be blamed rather than his real enemies. The locked door was staged. The angles were wrong because the killer was hidden in the cell next to his, shooting through bars that people forgot to examine." Her voice grew steady with controlled anger. Wade listened without interruption, his lawman's instincts recognizing the consistency and detail that marked truthful testimony. Everything she said made more sense than the supernatural explanations the town had embraced. But logic had never been popular when fear and prejudice offered simpler answers. "Why haven't you told people the truth?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Would they believe an Apache woman over their own fantasies? Katori asked in return. "It is easier for them to think I am a monster than to accept that they live in a world where good men die randomly and evil men escape justice. My guilt confirms their beliefs about the dangers of mixing races and cultures." My innocence would force them to examine their own complicity in creating the conditions that actually killed my husbands. Her analysis was harsh but accurate. Wade reached across the table and covered her hand with his own, feeling the calluses that spoke of hard work and the scars that testified to a life lived without the luxury of safety. "I believe you," he said simply, his words carrying the weight of a solemn oath. "And I think you're the most gorgeous woman I've ever met, not just in appearance, but in spirit, in courage, in the strength it takes to survive what you've survived without becoming bitter or broken." His declaration hung in the air between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. The weeks following Wade's first visit to Katori's homestead unfolded like the slow blooming of desert roses, each day bringing new revelations and deeper understanding. Between two souls who had lived too long in the shadows of other people's expectations, Wade found himself riding the familiar trail to her mesa every few days, always with practical excuses, checking on boundary markers, investigating reports of rustlers, following tracks that led conveniently in her direction. Katori never questioned these transparent pretenses, instead welcoming him with the quiet grace of a woman who had learned to value genuine companionship above social convention. Their conversations ranged from the practical matters of desert survival to the deeper questions of identity and belonging that haunted anyone who lived between two worlds. On a morning when the September air carried the first hint of autumn's approach, Wade arrived to find Katori working in her medicine garden, her hands carefully harvesting herbs that would sustain her through the coming winter. She moved among the plants with the reverence of someone who understood that each root and leaf held the power to heal or harm, depending on the knowledge and intention of the person wielding it. "Apache tea," she explained, holding up a bundle of dried leaves that released a fragrant aroma when crushed between her fingers. "My grandmother taught me to prepare it for those whose spirits had been wounded by loss or betrayal. It cannot restore what has been taken, but it can ease the pain of carrying grief too long." Her dark eyes met his with an understanding that transcended words. Wade dismounted and approached the garden, his movements careful and respectful in the presence of knowledge that predated his own culture by centuries. "Sounds like medicine. This territory could use," he said, thinking of the bitter men in the Broken Wheel Saloon, who carried their anger like a disease that infected everything they touched. "Healing requires more than herbs," Katori replied, her voice carrying the wisdom of someone who had treated wounds of the spirit as well as the flesh. "It requires the willingness to release old hurts and make space for new growth. Many people prefer their pain because it has become familiar, safer than the uncertainty of hope." She continued her careful harvesting, each plant selected with the precision of a master craftsman. Wade found himself studying her profile as she worked, noting the way morning light caught the silver threads woven through her dark hair. Careful efficiency of movements honed by years of practice, the quiet strength that radiated from her like heat from a well-tended fire. "You're talking about more than medicine, aren't you?" he asked. Her smile was soft as morning mist. "The heart and the body are not separate things, Wade. Wound one and the other suffers. Heal one and the other grows stronger. Your people understand this when dealing with horses and cattle, but seem to forget it when treating their own kind." She straightened, wiping soil from her hands with a cloth embroidered in traditional Apache patterns. That afternoon found them sitting in the shade of her portal, drinking cold tea brewed from mountain mint while Thunder and Katori's mare grazed together in companionable silence. The horses had taken to each other with the easy acceptance that often eluded their human counterparts, finding common ground in shared needs rather than dwelling on differences of breeding or origin. "Tell me about your grandmother," Wade requested, genuinely curious about the woman who had shaped Katori's understanding of the world. "The one who taught you about healing." He had learned to value these glimpses into her past, each story adding depth to his understanding of who she was and where she came from. Katori's expression grew distant, her eyes focusing on something. beyond the visible horizon. Ayana was her name. It means eternal blossom in our language. She lived through the worst years of the Apache Wars, saw her people driven from their ancestral lands and confined to reservations that were little better than prisons. But she never lost her knowledge or her dignity. Her voice carried pride, mixed with sorrow for all that had been lost. When I was young, maybe 7 or 8 years old, she would take me into the mountains to gather plants. She taught me to listen to the land, to understand the relationships between all living things. She said that healing was not about imposing human will upon nature, but about finding the balance that allowed natural processes to restore themselves. Katori's fingers traced patterns in the dust at her feet as she spoke. The army doctors at the reservation called her a witch doctor, dismissed her knowledge as primitive superstition. But when their medicines failed and their surgeries went wrong, they would quietly seek her out, begging for the remedies they publicly scorned. She helped them anyway, because healing knows no boundaries of race or politics. The bitter irony in her voice spoke of too many similar experiences. Wade felt a familiar anger building in his chest, the same rage that had driven him to defend her in the saloon, multiplied by weeks of growing understanding and deepening feeling. "Sounds like the same ignorance that blames you for your husband's deaths," he said quietly. "People who can't admit they don't understand something, so they call it evil instead." His words carried the conviction of a man whose opinions had been forged in the fire of personal experience. "My grandmother warned me that would happen," Katori replied, her voice steady despite the pain underlying her words. "She said that when an Apache woman chose to live in the white world, she would be blamed for every misfortune that befell those around her. They will make you a scapegoat for their own failures," she told me. "But do not let their ignorance define who you are or limit who you might become." The old woman's wisdom echoed across the years with prophetic accuracy. As autumn deepened and the leaves of Katori's fruit trees turned gold and crimson, Wade's visits became a regular pattern that both of them anticipated with quiet pleasure. He would arrive in the early afternoon, after the morning's ranch work was completed, but before the evening chores demanded his attention. Their time together had developed its own rhythm, work shared, meals prepared together, conversations that ranged from practical matters to deeper questions of philosophy and belief. On an October day when the air was crisp with the promise of winter, Wade found Katori preserving the last of her apple harvest, the kitchen filled with the warm scents of cinnamon and cloves. She moved between steaming pots and cooling jars with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned to waste nothing and prepare for lean times ahead. "Smells like heaven in here," Wade observed, hanging his hat on the peg by the door with the familiarity of someone who belonged in this space. He had begun keeping a spare shirt at her house, clean clothes for the inevitable occasions when ranch work left him too dusty for civilized company. "My mother's recipe," Katori replied, stirring a pot of apple butter that bubbled with thick sweetness. She learned it from a German woman at the reservation, one of the missionaries' wives who understood that survival required sharing knowledge across cultural boundaries. She tasted the mixture, adjusting the spices with the confidence of long practice. Wade stepped behind her, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from her body, close enough to catch the scent of sage and vanilla that had become associated in his mind with everything good and peaceful in the world. "Need help?" he asked, his voice rougher than usual. She leaned back against him for just a moment, allowing herself the luxury of human contact that had been absent from her life for too long. "The jars need to be moved to the cooling rack," she said softly, her voice betraying the effect of his nearness. They worked together in comfortable silence, their movements synchronized by weeks of shared domestic routines. Wade found himself marveling at how natural it felt to share these simple tasks with her, how the mundane work of daily life became something precious when performed in partnership with someone who understood both the necessity and the joy of making a home. "Wade," Katori said suddenly, her voice carrying a note of uncertainty that was unusual for her. "The people in town, they must be wondering about your visits here. Are they saying things that might damage your reputation or your business?" Her concern for his welfare touched something deep in his chest. Wade set down the jar he was holding and turned to face her fully, his gray eyes serious as storm clouds. "Let me be clear about something, Katori. I don't give a damn what the people in town think about my choices. I've lived my entire adult life by my own code, not by the opinions of folks who wouldn't know character if it bit them on the ass." His language was deliberately blunt, emphasizing the strength of his conviction. "But your ranch, your livelihood," she began, her voice tight with worry, "will survive just fine whether or not the good citizens of Copper Canyon approve." "Of my friendships," Wade interrupted gently. "I sell cattle to buyers in Denver and Santa Fe, not to the gossips in the Broken Wheel Saloon. My reputation is built on the quality of my stock and the reliability of my word, not on who I choose to share my time with." He reached out and touched her face, his calloused fingers gentle against her smooth skin. The moment stretched between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed, filled with the weight of unspoken feelings and the promise of possibilities that both of them had thought lost forever. Katori's eyes searched his face, looking for signs of doubt or reservation, finding instead a certainty that matched her own growing feelings. "I never thought I would feel this way again," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the bubbling of the apple butter on the stove. "After David's death, after the accusations and the isolation, I convinced myself that love was a luxury I could no longer afford." Her admission carried the vulnerability of someone who had learned to protect her heart by keeping it closed. "No," Wade replied, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone with reverent care. "I felt the same way after Sarah May died. Thought that chapter of my life was finished, that I was meant to live out my remaining years in solitude." His voice carried the weight of shared understanding. "But then you came to my door with flowers and respect and the kind of courage it takes to see past what everyone else thinks they know about a person." Katori continued, her hands finding their way to his chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat beneath her palms. "You looked at me and saw someone worth defending, worth knowing, worth loving." The last word was spoken so softly it was almost lost. Wade's response was to lower his head until his lips met hers, in a kiss that tasted of apple butter and cinnamon, of trust earned and barriers overcome, of two souls finding their way back to hope after long seasons of winter. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative as the first flowers of spring, then deeper as they discovered that the connection between them was real and lasting. When they finally separated, both were breathing harder, their foreheads resting together, as they absorbed the magnitude of what had just happened between them. The kitchen around them seemed transformed, charged with new possibilities and the promise of a future neither had dared imagine just weeks before. "The town will lose their minds," Katori said with a shaky laugh, though her tone suggested she cared less about public opinion than she once had. "Let them," Wade replied firmly, his arms tightening around her as if he could shield her from all future harm through the strength of his embrace. "We'll face whatever comes together. That's what people do when they love each other. They stand united against the world if necessary." His words carried the promise of a man who had found something worth fighting for. But even as Wade and Katori discovered the healing power of love, freely given and gratefully received, darker forces were already moving against them in the shadows of Copper Canyon. The news of Wade Harrison's regular visits to the Apache widow's homestead had spread through the town like wildfire, igniting the kind of gossip that turned molehills into mountains and suspicion into certainty. In the back room of the general store, 3 men huddled around a bottle of whiskey and a growing sense of outrage that someone they had considered a pillar of the community would so blatantly violate the unwritten codes that kept their world ordered and predictable. Frank Gully, the undertaker whose business had profited handsomely from the deaths of Katori's 3 husbands, paced the small space like a caged animal. "It ain't natural," Gully muttered, his pale hands gesturing wildly as he spoke. A decent white man consorting with that witch like she was some kind of respectable lady. Harrison's lost his mind, and he's going to get himself killed just like the others. His voice carried the fervor of someone whose worldview was being challenged by inconvenient facts. Tom Briggs nodded grimly from his position, slumped against a stack of flour sacks. Mark my words, boys. Within 6 months, we'll be digging another grave and asking ourselves why we didn't do something to stop it. That woman's got some kind of hold over men, turns them against their own kind. His theory, born of prejudice and nurtured by ignorance, had the appeal of simple answers to complex questions. But it was the third man who posed the real danger, sitting quietly in the corner while the others ranted about supernatural influences and racial mixing. Jeremiah Cole was Dr. Thornfield's cousin from back east, a man who had arrived in Copper Canyon 3 months earlier, claiming to be settling the dead physician's affairs. But his true purpose ran deeper than estate management, rooted in a conviction that his cousin had been murdered and a determination to see justice done according to his own twisted definition. Cole was a different breed of enemy than the simple-minded bigots who populated the saloon-educated, articulate, and possessed of the kind of calculating intelligence that made him far more dangerous than men driven by mere emotion. He had spent his months in town carefully gathering information, studying patterns, and developing a plan that would finally expose what he believed to be the truth about Katori Blackstone. "Gentlemen," Cole said quietly, his cultured voice cutting through their drunken complaints like a blade through silk. "Perhaps it's time we stopped talking about this problem and started taking action to solve it. If Wade Harrison insists on ignoring the obvious danger that woman represents, then it falls to us to protect him from his own folly." His words carried the authority of education and the conviction of someone who believed himself to be acting from noble motives. "What are you suggesting?" Gully asked, though his eager tone suggested he already knew the answer. Cole's smile was thin as winter ice. "I'm suggesting that we gather the evidence necessary to prove what we all know to be true, that Katori Blackstone is a murderer who has escaped justice for far too long. And if the law won't act on that evidence, then we'll have to take matters into our own hands." His plan, born of grief and nurtured by prejudice, would soon threaten everything that Wade and Katori had begun to build together. As October gave way to November and the first snows began to dust the highest peaks of the surrounding mountains, Wade and Katori continued to grow closer, their relationship deepening from friendship into something more profound and lasting. They had begun to speak tentatively of the future, of the possibility of marriage and the challenges it would bring in a territory where mixed unions were viewed with suspicion and hostility. "I want you to know," Wade said one evening as they sat by her fireplace watching the flames dance in the stone hearth, "that I understand what we'll be facing if we decide to make this official. There will be people who never accept our union, stores that won't serve us, churches that won't welcome us. I won't pretend it will be easy." His honesty was both painful and necessary. Katori curled closer to him on the worn leather sofa that had belonged to her first husband, her head resting on his shoulder as she considered the weight of his words. "I've already faced their rejection," she said quietly. "The question is whether you're prepared to share that burden. Once you marry an Apache woman, you'll be marked as different, set apart from the community you've been part of all your life." Her concern for his welfare outweighed her own desires. "I'd rather be set apart with you than accepted without you," Wade replied simply, his arms tightening around her as if he could protect her from all future harm through the strength of his embrace. "Besides, I've never been much for following other people's rules about how I should live my life. If loving you makes me an outcast, then I'll wear that title with pride." His words carried the conviction of a man who had found something worth any sacrifice. But even as they spoke of love and commitment, neither realized that Jeremiah Cole was already putting his plan into motion, gathering allies and evidence for a confrontation that would test their relationship in ways they couldn't imagine. The storm was approaching, and soon they would learn whether the foundation they had built together was strong enough to withstand the forces arrayed against them. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and driving the first reel. Snow of the season across the mesa like a white curtain drawn across the stage where their love story was unfolding. In the distance, a coyote howled, or perhaps it was something else entirely. Something that sensed the approaching darkness and cried out in warning to any who might listen. Jeremiah Cole possessed the kind of refined intelligence that made him infinitely more dangerous than the crude bigots who gathered in the Broken Wheel Saloon to trade conspiracy theories and rot-gut whiskey. A graduate of Harvard Medical School and the son of a prominent Boston family, he had arrived in Copper Canyon with credentials that commanded instant respect from the territorial authorities and a personal agenda that burned like acid in his cultured soul. His cousin William Thornfield had been more than family. He had been Cole's closest friend, research partner, and the one person who truly understood his revolutionary theories about combining traditional medicine with indigenous healing practices. When news of William's death reached Boston, Cole had immediately suspected foul play, convinced that his brilliant cousin could never have made the fatal error in judgment that territorial officials had attributed to his demise. Now, after 3 months of careful investigation and meticulous planning, Cole was ready to present his case to the territorial marshal, who was scheduled to arrive in Copper Canyon within the week. But first, he needed to eliminate the one obstacle that threatened to derail his carefully constructed narrative: Wade Harrison's inconvenient faith in Katori Blackstone's innocence. Cole's rented room above the general store had been transformed into a makeshift laboratory and evidence collection center, its walls covered with maps, photographs, and handwritten notes that detailed every aspect of the 3 suspicious deaths. Chemical apparatus borrowed from his cousin's abandoned surgery occupied one corner, while boxes of documents and witness statements filled another. This was the workspace of a man who approached murder like a scientific problem requiring systematic solution. The centerpiece of his investigation was a detailed timeline that tracked Katori's movements and activities in the days leading up to each husband's death. Using information gathered from servants, delivery boys, and anyone else who had observed her during those crucial periods, Cole had constructed what he believed to be an unshakable case for premeditated murder, motivated by greed and racial hatred. The pattern is undeniable, he murmured to himself, adjusting his wire-rimmed spectacles as he studied the carefully organized evidence. Each death follows the same basic structure: a period of apparent domestic harmony, followed by subtle changes in the victim's behavior, suggesting the introduction of mind-altering substances, culminating in death under circumstances that appear accidental but show clear signs of deliberate intervention. His educated analysis sounded convincing even to his own ears. Cole's plan relied on exploiting the existing prejudices of the territorial justice system, while presenting his case in terms that would appeal to educated officials who prided themselves on rational decision-making. He had prepared 3 separate reports, one for the territorial marshal, one for the military commander at Fort Stanton, and one for the federal investigators who specialized in crimes involving Indian territories. Each report emphasized different aspects of his theory while maintaining the central thesis that Katori Blackstone was a serial killer who had escaped justice due to the authorities' failure to take Apache methods of murder seriously. The marshal would receive evidence focusing on the legal inconsistencies in the original investigations. The military commander would learn about the potential threat to civilian Apache relations posed by allowing such crimes to go unpunished. The federal investigators would discover connections to broader patterns of violence in other territorial communities. But Cole's masterpiece was the psychological profile he had constructed of his target, drawing on the latest theories about criminal behavior and racial characteristics that were popular in Eastern academic circles. This document painted Katori as a calculating predator who used her exotic beauty and cultural mystique to entrap vulnerable white men, then eliminated them once she had gained access to their property and social position. The subject exhibits classic signs of sociopathic personality disorder, exacerbated by the primitive belief systems common to her race, Cole wrote in his final report. Her ability to maintain the facade of a grieving widow while systematically eliminating potential witnesses demonstrates a level of cunning that poses an ongoing threat to the entire Turiel community. The language was clinical, objective, and completely damning. Cole had also prepared contingency plans for dealing with Wade Harrison's predictable attempts to defend his Apache paramour. Witnesses had been coached to testify about the rancher's recent erratic behavior, his neglect of business responsibilities, and his increasing isolation from the white community. Medical experts from Santa Fe had been contacted about the psychological effects of prolonged exposure to Apache love magic, providing scientific justification for dismissing Wade's testimony as the delusions of a bewitched man. The first phase of Cole's plan involved planting carefully crafted rumors designed to undermine public confidence in both Katori and Wade while creating an atmosphere of crisis that would justify drastic action. He began by sharing selected portions of his research with influential community members, presenting himself as a concerned relative seeking truth and justice, rather than a vengeful enemy plotting destruction. Judge Harrison Blackwood, the territorial magistrate who presided over the county court, received a private briefing about potential federal intervention in local affairs if the Blackstone case remained unresolved. Cole emphasized the negative attention that unsolved murders involving racial mixing could bring to a territory seeking statehood, appealing to the judge's political ambitions and his desire to maintain order, Your Honor. Cole said during their confidential meeting in the judge's private chambers, "I have reason to believe that my cousin's death was part of a larger pattern of criminal activity that federal authorities are beginning to investigate. If we can resolve this matter quickly and decisively at the local level, it will demonstrate territorial competence and prevent outside interference in our affairs." His appeal to judicial pride and territorial autonomy struck exactly the right note. Dr. Samuel Morrison, the Army physician at Fort Stanton, received a different approach focused on the medical aspects of the case. Cole shared his theories about exotic poisons and Apache methods of murder that military doctors might not recognize, suggesting that specialized knowledge was required to properly investigate such crimes. "Doctor," Cole explained over brandy and cigars in the fort's officers' club, "the Apache have access to plant toxins that can mimic natural death so perfectly that only someone trained in both Western medicine and indigenous pharmacology would recognize the signs of poisoning. My cousin was conducting research into these very substances when he died, research that may have made him a target for those who preferred to keep such knowledge secret." The combination of professional curiosity and racial paranoia proved irresistible. Cole's most crucial ally proved to be Captain Robert Sterling, the commanding officer at Fort Stanton, whose military career had been built on the principle that the only good Indian was a controlled Indian. Sterling had watched the relative peace between Apache communities and white settlers with the suspicious eye of a soldier who understood that tranquility often preceded uprising. "Mr. Cole," Sterling said during their private consultation, "your investigation raises serious questions about the effectiveness of current policies regarding Indian-white relations in this territory. If this woman has indeed been murdering white citizens with impunity, it suggests that our existing oversight mechanisms are inadequate to protect law-abiding settlers." The captain's concerns were genuine, making him all the more useful to Cole's purposes. Sterling's support provided Cole with military authority to back his civilian investigation, creating a powerful combination that could overwhelm any local resistance to his conclusions. More importantly, the captain's involvement gave Cole access to federal resources and communication networks, that could spread his version of events far beyond the boundaries of Copper Canyon, the territorial marshal, when he finally arrived for his scheduled inspection, found a community primed for dramatic action and a case file that seemed to demand immediate intervention. Marshal Thomas Garrett was a conscientious official who genuinely wanted to serve justice, but he lacked the local knowledge necessary to distinguish between legitimate evidence and carefully constructed fabrication. "Marshal," Cole explained, "during their initial briefing, I've spent 3 months reconstructing the events surrounding my cousin's death and the 2 previous murders that follow an identical pattern. The evidence suggests a level of premeditation and criminal sophistication that poses an ongoing threat to every white male in this territory who might be vulnerable to the suspect's methods." His presentation was professional, convincing, completely misleading. Cole's background in medical research had taught him the importance of physical evidence in supporting theoretical conclusions. Working alone in his makeshift laboratory, he had carefully recreated what he claimed were the chemical compounds used to poison Dr. Thornfield, using his cousin's own research notes to produce convincing samples of exotic toxins supposedly derived from Apache plant knowledge. The glass vials filled with various colored liquids looked appropriately sinister when displayed alongside Cole's detailed chemical analyses and theoretical explanations of their effects on human physiology. To officials unfamiliar with advanced chemistry, the evidence appeared both scientifically rigorous and practically damning. More insidiously, Cole had begun introducing trace amounts of these same compounds into items that could be linked to Katori's household herbs purchased from the general store where she shopped, water samples taken from the well near her property, even soil samples from her garden. When analyzed by territorial chemists, these materials would reveal the presence of the same exotic toxins found in his reconstructed evidence, creating an apparently unbreakable chain of proof. The contamination is subtle but unmistakable, Cole explained to Marshal Garrett, displaying his chemical findings with the confidence of an expert witness. These compounds occur naturally in certain desert plants, but their concentration and combination in materials associated with the suspect's property suggests deliberate cultivation and preparation for criminal purposes. His scientific credentials gave weight to conclusions that were entirely fraudulent. Cole had also prepared forged documentation, suggesting that Katori had been asking suspicious questions about her husband's financial affairs in the weeks before each death. Bank records had been altered to show unusual withdrawals and transfers. Insurance documents had been modified to inflate the monetary benefits she had received from each death. Property deeds had been adjusted to suggest a pattern of systematic acquisition of white-owned land through marriage and murder. As November turned to December and the first serious snowstorms began to isolate the mountain communities, Cole put the finishing touches on his plan for the dramatic confrontation that would destroy both Katori and Wade while establishing his own reputation as a defender of territorial justice. The timing was crucial. He needed to act before the winter weather made travel impossible. But after he had fully prepared his network of allies and evidence, the territorial marshal had agreed to conduct a formal investigation beginning the following week with federal backing that would override any local objections. Captain Sterling had committed military resources to ensure that the suspect could not escape into Apache territory if she attempted to flee. Judge Blackwood had prepared arrest warrants that would be served simultaneously with the investigation's commencement. Most importantly, Cole had arranged for newspaper reporters from Santa Fe and Denver to witness the proceedings, ensuring that his version of events would reach a wider audience regardless of the investigation's ultimate outcome. Public opinion, once properly informed about the nature of the threat, would make it impossible for territorial authorities to ignore or minimize the case. Within a week, Cole wrote in his private journal, "Justice will finally be served for William's death and the deaths of the other innocent men who fell victim to this creature's schemes. The territorial government will be forced to acknowledge the sophisticated nature of Apache criminal methods and new policies will be implemented to prevent similar tragedies in other communities. His sense of righteous mission justified any methods necessary to achieve his goals. But Cole had made one crucial miscalculation in his otherwise meticulous planning. He had underestimated the depth of Wade Harrison's commitment to the woman he loved and the lengths to which a man of the frontier would go to protect what he held dear. The confrontation he was orchestrating would indeed determine Katori's fate, but not in the way he anticipated. As snow began to fall over the Red Rock mesas and the wind carried the promise of a harsh winter ahead, the stage was set for a battle that would test not only the strength of Wade and Katori's love, but the very foundations of justice and truth in a territory where prejudice often masqueraded as law and personal vendettas could destroy innocent lives with the blessing of legal authority. December arrived in Copper Canyon like an avenging angel wrapped in white robes and bitter wind, bringing with it the kind of cold that settled in a man's bones and refused to leave. The storm that had been building for weeks finally broke on a Tuesday morning when Marshal Thomas Garrett rode into town at the head of a federal cavalry unit, their brass buttons gleaming against blue wool uniforms and their faces set with the grim determination of men carrying out unpleasant but necessary duties. Wade Harrison was mending fence on the south pasture when he saw the dust cloud approaching from town, a brown smudge against the white backdrop of fresh snow that could only mean trouble of the official variety. 23 years of frontier living had taught him to read the signs of approaching danger, and everything about this military procession screamed federal intervention in local affairs. He mounted thunder with the fluid grace of a man who had spent more time in the saddle than on foot, spurring the big stallion toward town with an urgency born of sudden understanding. Whatever was happening, it involved more than territorial law enforcement. This was the kind of operation that ended with people dead or disappeared. And Wade had a cold certainty that Katori was at the center of it. The streets of Copper Canyon buzzed with nervous energy as townspeople gathered in doorways and behind windows to watch the cavalry unit establish a command post in front of the Broken Wheel Saloon. Marshal Garrett conferred with Captain Sterling while soldiers positioned themselves at strategic points throughout the town, their Spencer carbines held at ready position. This was not a routine investigation. This was a military operation designed to crush any resistance before it could form. Wade dismounted near the general store, his gray eyes taking in the deployment of federal forces with the tactical awareness of a man who had fought his share of battles. Whatever Jeremiah Cole had set in motion, it was moving with the inexorable momentum of an avalanche, sweeping aside everything in its path toward a predetermined conclusion. Marshal Garrett stepped onto the raised wooden platform outside the saloon, his voice carrying across the gathered crowd with the authority of federal law. "Citizens of Copper Canyon," he began, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air, "I am here on orders from the territorial governor to investigate a series of murders that have been allowed to go unpunished for far too long." The formal language carried an implicit criticism of local law enforcement. Evidence has come to light suggesting that Mrs. Katori Blackstone has systematically murdered 3 white citizens of this territory using sophisticated methods designed to avoid detection by local authorities. These crimes represent not only a threat to individual safety, but a challenge to the rule of law that governs relations between Indian and white communities. Garrett's words fell like hammer blows on the assembled crowd. Wade felt his blood turn to ice as the marshal continued his pronouncement, each accusation more damning than the last. The careful framework of lies that Cole had constructed was being presented as established fact, backed by the full authority of territorial government and supported by scientific evidence that seemed unassailable to those who lacked the knowledge to question its authenticity. Mr. Jeremiah Cole, a respected physician and researcher from Boston, has provided this office with comprehensive documentation proving that the deaths of Marcus Bellwether, Dr. William Thornfield, and Sheriff David Crenshaw were not accidents or suicides, but carefully planned murders executed using Apache poison knowledge and designed to appear as natural deaths. The marshal's clinical recitation made the charges sound both professional and irrefutable. Furthermore, Garrett continued, his voice gaining strength as he delivered the coup de grace, evidence suggests that Mrs. Blackstone's current association with rancher Wade Harrison represents an ongoing threat to another potential victim. Mr. Harrison's recent behavior indicates possible exposure to the same mind-altering substances used on previous victims, compromising his ability to recognize the danger he faces. The implication was clear. Wade's defense of Katori was itself evidence of her guilt. The crowd's murmur of shocked approval was cut short when Wade Harrison stepped forward, his presence commanding attention despite the overwhelming display of federal authority arrayed against him. The rancher's weathered face showed no fear, only the cold anger of a man who had witnessed injustice masquerading as law. "Marshal Garrett," Wade said, his voice carrying across the square with the clarity of mountain air. "I've known Katori Blackstone for months now, and I'm here to tell you that every word of these charges is a damned lie." His blunt contradiction of federal authority sent a ripple of unease through the gathered soldiers. "Mr. Harrison," the marshal replied with the patience of an official dealing with a deluded citizen, "I understand your loyalty to this woman, but the evidence against her is overwhelming. Dr. Cole has provided chemical analyses, witness testimony, and documentary proof that Dr. Cole has provided a pack of lies dressed up in fancy language," Wade interrupted, his gray eyes blazing with righteous fury. "I don't know what his game is, but it sure as hell isn't justice. That woman has done more good for this community than any 10 of the men standing here gawking like sheep at a slaughter." His words carried the conviction of absolute certainty. "Captain." Sterling stepped forward, his hand resting on the grip of his service revolver. "Mr. Harrison, you're interfering with a federal investigation. I suggest you step aside and allow us to proceed with our duties." The military officer's tone carried the implicit threat of force. Wade's laugh was harsh as winter wind. "Federal investigation? This is a lynch mob with fancy uniforms and official papers. You're about to arrest an innocent woman based on the word of a man who's been in this territory for 3 months, while ignoring the testimony of someone who's actually taken the time to know her." His challenge hung in the air like a gauntlet thrown at the feet of federal authority, but Wade's protests carried no weight against the momentum of official proceedings that had been carefully orchestrated to overwhelm any opposition. "Marshal." Garrett nodded to his men, who moved with practiced efficiency toward the trail that led to Katori's Mesa homestead. The die had been cast, and nothing short of armed resistance could stop what was about to unfold. Wade swung into Thunder's saddle with desperate urgency, spurring the stallion toward the narrow trail that climbed to Katori's isolated home. He had perhaps a 10-minute head start on the cavalry unit, barely enough time to warn her, but nowhere near sufficient to plan an escape. The mountains were already locked in winter's grip, making flight impossible for anyone unfamiliar with Apache survival techniques. He found Katori in her kitchen, grinding corn for the evening meal with the steady rhythm of a woman at peace with her world. She looked up as he burst through the door, reading the desperation in his face with the intuitive understanding that had grown between them over months of shared intimacy. "They're coming," Wade said without preamble, his chest heaving from the hard ride up the mountain trail. "Federal marshal, cavalry unit, arrest warrants, the whole damned circus. Cole's convinced them you're a murderer, and they're not interested in hearing any evidence to the contrary." His words tumbled out in a rush of urgency and rage. Katori set down her grinding stone with the calm deliberation of someone who had always known this moment would come. "How long do we have?" she asked, her voice steady despite the fear that flickered in her dark eyes. "Maybe 5 minutes before they reach the house," Wade replied, his mind racing through possible options and finding them all inadequate. "Katori, we need to run. I know places in the high country where we could hide until spring. ways to get you to Apache territory where they can't follow. His proposal carried the desperation of a man facing the loss of everything that mattered. She moved to the window and looked down at the approaching dust cloud, her expression peaceful despite the mortal danger racing toward them. No, Wade, running would only prove their accusations true. Besides, you would be giving up everything. You've built here your ranch, your reputation, your entire life for a woman. They've already decided as guilty. Her refusal carried the strength of someone who had faced persecution before. The sound of horses and jingling equipment announced the arrival of the federal unit before Wade could argue further with Katori's decision to face her accusers rather than flee from them. Marshal Garrett's voice rang out across the compound, amplified by the thin mountain air and the authority of his office. Mrs. Katori Blackstone, by order of the territorial government, you are under arrest for the murders of Marcus Bellwether, William Thornfield, and David Crenshaw. Come out with your hands visible and surrender yourself to federal custody. The formal language carried the weight of legal inevitability. Wade stepped onto the portal beside Katori, his hand resting on the grip of his Colt .45 in a gesture that was both protective and defiant. She's not going anywhere with you people, he called back, his voice carrying across the distance between the house and the mounted soldiers. Not until you present some real evidence instead of the manufactured lies you've been peddling. His challenge was both brave and futile, Mr. Harrison, Marshal Garrett replied, his patience clearly wearing thin. You are obstructing a federal investigation and threatening the safety of law enforcement officers. Stand down immediately or face arrest yourself. The ultimatum carried the implicit threat of violence that had been building since the cavalry unit's arrival. But it was Jeremiah Cole who provided the final catalyst for the confrontation that followed, stepping out from behind the mounted soldiers with the confident smile of a man whose carefully laid plans were finally reaching fruition. Wade, he called out, his educated voice carrying false concern. I understand your confusion, but you're defending a woman who murdered my cousin in cold blood. The evidence is overwhelming: chemical analyses, witness testimony, documentary proof of her criminal pattern. His appearance on the scene transformed abstract accusations into personal vendetta. Wade's response was immediate and volcanic. You lying son of a bitch, he roared, his hand moving to his weapon with the speed of a striking rattlesnake. You've manufactured every piece of so-called evidence in your arsenal, and you know it. This isn't about justice, this is about revenge. Against a woman who had nothing to do with your cousin's death. His accusation cut through the mountain air like a blade. The standoff might have continued indefinitely, frozen in the tableau of opposing wills and conflicting claims of justice. But Cole's next words shattered the fragile peace like a gunshot through glass. Mrs. Blackstone, he called out, his voice carrying the mocking certainty of a man who believed himself untouchable. Your Apache witchcraft may have fooled these simple frontier folk, but it won't work on educated men who understand the scientific principles behind your primitive poison knowledge. His deliberate provocation was designed to goad either Wade or Katori into rash action. Wade's Colt cleared leather with the fluid motion of a man who had survived 20 years on a frontier, where hesitation meant death, the barrel swinging toward Cole with lethal intent. But Captain Sterling had been watching for exactly this moment, and his own weapon spoke first, the sharp crack of his service revolver echoing across the mesa like breaking thunder. The bullet took Wade high in the left shoulder, spinning him around and sending him stumbling against the adobe wall of Katori's house. Blood spread across his white shirt like a crimson flower blooming in snow, but his right hand still gripped his weapon, and his gray eyes burned with undiminished fury. Wade! Katori's cry of anguish cut through the gunshot echoes as she rushed to his side, her hands already moving to staunch the bleeding with the practiced efficiency of someone trained in battlefield medicine. Her touch was gentle despite the urgency, her fingers probing the wound with the knowledge born of years treating injured warriors and wounded animals. "I'm all right," Wade gasped, though the pallor of his face and the tremor in his voice suggested otherwise. "Just a flesh wound. I've had worse from ornery cattle." His attempt at humor fooled no one, least of all the woman whose hands were already slick with his blood. Marshal Garrett used the chaos following the shooting to advance his men closer to the house, their weapons trained on both Wade and Katori as they prepared to complete the arrest that had brought them to this isolated mesa. "This has gone far enough," the marshal announced, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "Mrs. Blackstone, you will surrender immediately or face the consequences of continued resistance to federal authority." His ultimatum brooked no further delay, but Katori's response surprised everyone present, including Wade, who had expected her to either fight or flee rather than submit to arrest based on fabricated charges. She rose slowly from beside the wounded rancher, her hands raised in the universal gesture of surrender, her dark eyes blazing with a dignity that transcended the humiliation of capture. "I will come with you," she said quietly, her voice carrying across the distance between the house and the mounted soldiers with perfect clarity. "But know this, I am innocent of the charges you bring against me, and the truth will eventually expose the lies that have brought you here." Her words carried the weight of absolute conviction. "Katori, no." Wade struggled to rise despite his wound, his good hand reaching for her as she stepped away from the relative safety of the house. "Don't give them what they want, make them prove their case in court, where lies can't hide behind federal authority." His plea carried the desperation of a man watching everything precious slip away. "The truth will come out, Wade," she replied, her eyes meeting his with a love that transcended the immediate danger they faced. "But not if we fight them here and now. They want us to resist so they can claim we died while resisting arrest. I won't give them that satisfaction." Her strategic thinking impressed even her captors with its clarity, as federal soldiers moved to place shackles on Katori's wrists, treating her with the rough efficiency reserved for dangerous criminals. Jerry Cole made the mistake that would ultimately destroy his carefully constructed case. Drunk on the success of his plan and eager to savor his moment of triumph, he approached Wade with the swagger of a man who believed himself untouchable. "Your Apache witch is finally going to pay for what she did to William," Cole said, his voice low enough that only Wade could hear. "I've spent 6 months building a case that no territorial court will be able to ignore, complete with chemical evidence that will hang her higher than a kite." His gloating revealed more than he intended. Wade's eyes sharpened despite the pain of his wound, his lawman's instincts recognizing something significant in Cole's choice of words. 6 months? He repeated, his voice deceptively casual. "Funny thing about that, your cousin only died 3 months ago, according to the official records. How exactly were you building the case before you knew there was a crime to investigate?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. Cole's face went pale as he realized his mistake, the slip of tongue that revealed the premeditation behind his supposed quest for justice. "I misspoke," he said quickly, "but the damage was already done. I meant 3 months since I arrived to settle William's affairs and discovered the suspicious circumstances of his death." His hasty correction only emphasized the significance of his error. "No," Wade said, his voice gaining strength despite his physical weakness. "You said 6 months, and that means you were planning this frame-up before your cousin was even dead. Which means you know exactly how he really died, because you were there when it happened." The accusation struck Cole like a physical blow. Marshal Garrett had been close enough to overhear this exchange, and his expression shifted from confident authority to troubled uncertainty as he processed the implications of what he had just witnessed. "Dr. Cole," he said slowly, "perhaps you could clarify the timeline of your investigation for the record." His request carried the weight of official scrutiny, but Cole's response was to step backward toward his horse, his hand moving toward the concealed weapon beneath his coat with the desperate urgency of a man whose elaborate deception was collapsing around him. The timeline is irrelevant, he said, his cultured voice cracking under the pressure of exposure. The evidence speaks for itself, regardless of when the investigation began. His retreat toward his mount betrayed his intention to flee before further questions could destroy his credibility. Wade's shout of warning came just as Cole's hidden pistol cleared his coat, the small nickel-plated revolver gleaming in the winter sunlight, as he swung it toward the wounded rancher who had exposed his lies. But Katori moved faster than anyone thought possible, her body interposing itself between the weapon and Wade, with the selfless courage of someone willing to die for love. The shot that followed would echo through the red rock canyons of Mesa Verde territory for years to come, marking the moment when truth finally began to triumph over carefully constructed lies and innocent love proved stronger than educated hatred. The crack of Cole's nickel-plated revolver split the mountain air like breaking glass, but the bullet that should have found Wade Harrison's heart instead buried itself in the adobe wall behind him as Katori's desperate lunge knocked the weapon off target. She crashed into Cole with the fury of a wounded mountain lion, her fingernails raking across his face as they tumbled together into the snow-covered dirt of her compound. Marshal Garrett's shout of, "Drop your weapon," rang across the mesa as federal soldiers swung their carbines toward the struggling figures, but the entangled combatants made a clean shot impossible. Cole's educated hands proved no match for the survival instincts of a woman who had learned to fight from Apache warriors, and his pistol flew from his grasp to land in a patch of melting snow. "She's trying to kill me," Cole screamed as Katori's knee found his ribs with devastating accuracy, his cultured voice cracking under the strain of genuine terror. "Shoot her before she murders me like she did the others." His desperate plea revealed the cowardice that lurked beneath the sophisticated facade. But Captain Sterling had been watching Cole's behavior throughout the confrontation, and the physician's premature knowledge of his cousin's death timeline had planted seeds of doubt that now bloomed into full suspicion. "Stand down," he ordered his men, his military training recognizing the signs of a man whose story didn't match his actions. "Let them separate, and we'll sort this out properly." His decision to pause rather than shoot would prove crucial too. Everything that followed, Wade struggled to his feet despite his wounded shoulder, using his good arm to pull Katori away from Cole before the terrified doctor could produce another hidden weapon. "It's over, Cole," he said, his voice steady despite the pain coursing through his body. "Your slip about the 6-month timeline just proved you're a liar and probably a murderer yourself." His accusation carried the weight of absolute conviction, Jeremiah. Cole sat in the bloody snow, his expensive clothes torn and his face bearing the scratches left by Katori's defensive assault, looking nothing like the distinguished physician who had arrived in Copper Canyon 3 months earlier with impressive credentials and a compelling story of family tragedy. The mask of civilized respectability had been stripped away, revealing something desperate and vicious underneath. "You don't understand," Cole gasped, his breath forming ragged clouds in the frigid air. "William was going to destroy everything. We'd worked for our research, our reputation, our future in academic medicine. He'd gone native, started believing Apache superstitions about plant spirits and vision quests. He was going to publish papers that would have made us both laughingstocks in legitimate medical circles." His confession tumbled out like water through a broken dam. Marshal Garrett dismounted and approached the fallen physician with the careful steps of a lawman who had just realized his case was built on quicksand. "Are you saying you came to New Mexico territory to stop your cousin from publishing his research?" The marshal's question carried the weight of official investigation. "I came to talk sense into him," Cole replied, his voice taking on the whining tone of a man caught in his own web of lies. "To convince him that combining Apache folk medicine with legitimate pharmaceutical research would destroy his career and mine by association." But he wouldn't listen. He'd become obsessed with that woman and her primitive healing knowledge. His words painted a picture of jealousy and professional rivalry rather than justice-seeking. Wade's gray eyes blazed with understanding as the final pieces of the puzzle fell into place. So you killed him yourself and then spent 3 months building a case to frame Katori for murder. You couldn't stand the thought of your cousin choosing Apache wisdom over your Harvard education. His accusation struck Cole like a physical blow. It was an accident. Cole screamed, his composure finally cracking completely. William threatened to expose my research methods, said I'd been falsifying data and stealing credit for discoveries made by Apache healers. He was going to ruin me, destroy everything I'd worked for. I only meant to knock him unconscious, but the dosage was too strong and his heart couldn't handle the combination of drugs. His confession poured out in a rush of guilt and terror, Captain. Sterling stepped forward with the grim expression of a military officer who had just realized he'd been used as a pawn in someone else's game. Dr. Cole, you're under arrest for the murder of Dr. William Thornfield and for filing false reports with federal authorities. His voice carried the cold anger of a professional soldier who despised being manipulated. You can't arrest me. Cole protested, struggling to his feet with the desperate energy of a cornered animal. I'm a respected physician, a graduate of Harvard Medical School. My credentials speak for themselves. Who are you going to believe, me or an Apache witch? And a deluded rancher? His appeal to racial and educational prejudice fell on deaf ears. Marshal Garrett pulled out his notebook and began documenting Cole's spontaneous confession, his lawman's training taking over as he recognized the significance of what he had just witnessed. Dr. Cole, everything you've said in the past few minutes contradicts the evidence you provided about Mrs. Blackstone's guilt. Are you now claiming that you falsified that evidence? His questions were designed to lock Cole into admissions that couldn't be retracted. The evidence was reconstructed based on my medical knowledge of what must have happened, Cole said desperately, trying to backtrack from his damaging admissions. I used scientific principles to demonstrate how the murders could have been committed, not to falsify anything. His distinction between reconstruction and fabrication fooled no one present, but it was Katori who delivered the most devastating blow to Cole's crumbling defense, speaking for the first time since the violence began. You made one mistake. In your reconstruction, Dr. Cole, she said quietly, her voice carrying the authority of someone who possessed knowledge that transcended formal education. The plants you claimed I used to poison your cousin, they don't grow in this territory. They're native to the eastern forests, found in the same regions where you learned your pharmaceutical research. Her words carried the weight of irrefutable truth. Cole's face went ashen as he realized the implications of her statement. In his eagerness to create exotic evidence that would support his theories about Apache poison knowledge, he had inadvertently revealed his own familiarity with toxic plants that no Western Apache would ever have encountered. As federal soldiers placed shackles on Jeremiah Cole's wrists, treating him with the rough efficiency he had expected them to use on Katori, the assembled townspeople who had followed the cavalry unit up the mountain trail began to understand the magnitude of the injustice they had nearly witnessed. Tom Briggs stood with his hat in his hands, his weathered face showing the shame of a man who had allowed prejudice to blind him to truth. Mrs. Blackstone, he said quietly, his voice carrying across the compound with the weight of genuine remorse. I owe you an apology that no words can properly express. We let our fears and our ignorance make us accomplices to a madman's scheme. His admission opened the floodgates for similar confessions from other townspeople. Doc Patterson pushed through the crowd to examine Wade's wounded shoulder, his medical bag already open, as he began cleaning and dressing the bullet wound with practiced efficiency. This is going to need proper attention, he muttered, his professional focus temporarily overriding the emotional drama surrounding them. But you'll live to regret being a stubborn fool who thinks he can take on the federal government, single-handed. His gruff concern carried the affection of an old friend. Wade endured the medical treatment with stoic patience, His attention focused entirely on Katori as she stood surrounded by the wreckage of Cole's elaborate conspiracy. "I'm sorry you had to go through this," he said softly, his voice carrying all the love and regret that words could express. No one should have to face that kind of systematic hatred and still find the strength to forgive. His apology encompassed not just the immediate crisis, but years of community persecution. Katori moved to his side with the graceful dignity that had always marked her bearing, her hand finding his uninjured one with the natural ease of long intimacy. "The hatred was never about me," she said quietly, her dark eyes holding wisdom earned through suffering. "It was about their own fears and limitations. Healing those wounds will take time, but it can happen if people are willing to let go of old prejudices and make space for new understanding." Her words offered hope for reconciliation. Spring came early to Mesaverde territory that year, as if the land itself was eager to wash away the bitter memories of winter with warm rain and blooming wildflowers. The wedding of Wade Harrison and Katori Blackstone took place in the garden behind her Mesa homestead, surrounded by friends who had learned to see past the color of skin to the content of character. Judge Blackwood, chastened by his role in nearly enabling a miscarriage of justice, performed the ceremony with words that acknowledged both the couple's courage and the community's obligation to do better. "Marriage is an act of faith," he said, his voice carrying across the assembled guests. "Faith in love's power to overcome hatred, understanding's ability to defeat ignorance, and hope's capacity to triumph over fear." His words seemed to encompass more than just the union of two people. The bride wore white silk embroidered with traditional Apache symbols of prosperity and protection, her long dark hair adorned with silver ornaments that caught the morning light like captured stars. The groom stood beside her in his best black suit, his left arm still supported by a sling, but his face radiant with the joy of a man who had found his heart's desire. When they exchanged rings forged from silver, mined in the local mountains and blessed according to both Christian and Apache traditions, every person present understood they were witnessing something more than a wedding. They were seeing the birth of a new kind of community, one built on acceptance rather than suspicion. The reception that followed featured food from both cultures, music that blended fiddle tunes with tribal chants, and dancing that brought together people who had spent years avoiding each other's company. Children played together without regard for racial boundaries, their laughter providing a soundtrack for the healing that was finally beginning to take root. Years passed, and the story of the Apache widow, who was falsely accused, and the rancher who defended her became the stuff of local legend, told around campfires and in saloons throughout the territory. But the real legacy of their love was visible in the changes that gradually transformed Copper Canyon from a divided community into something approaching the American ideal of unity and diversity. Wade and Katori's ranch became a place where Apache and white settlers worked together, sharing knowledge and resources in ways that benefited everyone involved. Their children grew up bilingual and bicultural, equally comfortable in both worlds and serving as bridges between communities that had once viewed each other with suspicion and fear. The medical practice that Katori established in town combined traditional Apache healing with modern pharmaceutical knowledge, creating treatment options that neither culture could have developed alone. Her reputation as a healer spread throughout the territory, bringing patients from as far away as Santa Fe and Denver to seek remedies that conventional medicine couldn't provide. When Wade's hair turned silver and Katori's face showed the gentle lines of a life well lived, they would sit on their portal in the evening, watching the sunset paint the red rock mesas in shades of gold and crimson. Their love had not only survived the test of prejudice and persecution, it had created something beautiful and lasting that would endure long after they were gone. "Do you ever regret it?" Wade asked one evening as they watched their grandchildren playing in the garden where their love had first bloomed. "The hardships we faced, the people who never accepted us, the battles we had to fight just to be together?" His question carried the weight of a lifetime's reflection. Katori smiled and took his weathered hand in hers, their fingers intertwining with the natural ease of decades of partnership. "Every challenge we faced made our love stronger," she replied, her voice carrying the wisdom of a woman who had learned that the most precious things in life were worth fighting for. Besides, someone had to show this territory that love can conquer hatred if people are brave enough to choose it. Her words carried the quiet satisfaction of a life lived according to principle. As the stars emerged in the darkening sky above Mesaverde territory, their light bore witness to a love that had transformed not just two hearts, but an entire community. And in the distance, carried on the desert wind, the sound of children's laughter promised that the legacy of courage and acceptance would continue long into the future. The Apache widow in black had never been cursed, she had been blessed with the strength to survive persecution and the wisdom to forgive those who had wronged her. The lonely rancher who called her gorgeous had seen what others missed, that true beauty lies not in conformity to expectations, but in the courage to remain authentic in the face of overwhelming pressure to change. Together, they had proven that love knows no boundaries of race or culture, that justice can triumph over prejudice when good people find the courage to stand up for what's right, and that the most powerful force in the world is not hatred or fear, but the simple human capacity to see the divine spark that exists in every soul. In the end, everyone in Copper Canyon learned to see Katori Blackstone not as the Apache widow to be feared, but as the woman whose love had taught them all what it meant to be truly human.
Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.